Welcome to Stories of Brilliance, where captivating tales of mystery, suspense, and unexpected twists come to life. Today, we embark on an emotional journey of loss, love, and redemption. This is the story of a millionaire woman whose life takes a dramatic turn when she discovers her long-lost child in the most unlikely place. It was a night filled with both joy and sorrow. In a luxurious mansion overlooking the shimmering city lights, Eleanor Hart clutched a tiny pair of baby shoes to her chest. Her life had always been one of privilege, born into wealth, educated in the finest schools, and married into a family with a legacy of power. But on this fateful night, her heart broke into pieces. Eleanor had given birth to a baby boy, Ethan, only to be told mere hours later that he didn't survive. The hospital staff had been sympathetic but distant, and her husband, Richard, had urged her to move on for the sake of appearances. But Eleanor couldn't. The emptiness in her arms and the ache in her soul refused to let her forget. In the years that followed, Eleanor poured herself into her work, growing Hart Industries into a business empire. Despite her professional success, she remained a shadow of her former self, her smile never reaching her eyes. She secretly funded charities for orphaned children and spent countless nights reviewing adoption records, driven by an inexplicable feeling that her son was still out there somewhere. One evening, while attending a charity gala, Eleanor overheard a conversation between two former hospital staff members. They spoke in hushed tones about that baby mix-up years ago, a scandal that had been swiftly covered up to protect the hospital's reputation. Eleanor's heart raced as she pieced together fragments of their whispered words. Could it be possible? Had her child been taken from her? Eleanor hired a private investigator the very next day, a decision that would alter her life forever. Weeks turned into months, and the investigator's findings were both shocking and heart-wrenching. Her son was alive, but the life he had endured was far from the one she had dreamed of giving him. The boy, now a young man of 18, had been raised in harsh conditions after being abandoned by the family who had taken him. His name was no longer Ethan, but Aaron, and he worked as a laborer in one of Hart Industries' very own factories. The irony was cruel. Her son, toiling in obscurity within the empire she had built, bullied by co-workers who mocked his humble origins. Eleanor sat in stunned silence as she reviewed the report, her hands trembling. How could she approach him? How could she make things right after all these years? As a mother, she was filled with both hope and fear. Would he hate her for the life he had endured? With tears streaming down her face, Eleanor made a vow. She would reclaim her son, no matter the cost. But little did she know, the road ahead would be far more treacherous than she could imagine. Stay tuned for part 2 of this gripping tale as Eleanor takes her first steps toward reuniting with her long-lost son and uncovering the truth about the tragic events that tore them apart. Eleanor Hart couldn't sleep. The revelation that her son was alive filled her with a whirlwind of emotions, hope, guilt, and a fierce determination. She spent the night staring at the investigator's report, her fingers tracing the photograph of a young man with piercing brown eyes that mirrored her own. This was her son, Ethan, Aaron. Whatever name he went by, he was hers. The next morning, Eleanor arrived unannounced at the factory where Aaron worked. The place was a stark contrast to the luxury she was accustomed to. It was loud, grimy, and filled with workers who wore exhaustion like a second skin. Clad in simple attire to blend in, she walked through the factory floor with purpose, her eyes scanning every face. And then she saw him. Aaron was hauling a heavy crate, his face streaked with sweat and grime. His movements were strong and precise, but his demeanor spoke of someone used to being overlooked. Eleanor's heart clenched as she watched a group of workers jeer at him, pushing him aside as if he were invisible. "Hey, orphan boy!" "Try not to drop it this time," one of them sneered, and the others erupted in laughter. Aaron clenched his jaw but said nothing, his gaze fixed on his work. Eleanor's maternal instincts flared. She wanted to intervene, to shield him from the cruelty of the world. But she stopped herself, knowing she needed to tread carefully. For now, she could only observe. After spending hours on the factory floor, Eleanor retreated to her car, her mind racing. How could she bridge the chasm of years that separated them? She decided to take the first step by visiting the orphanage where he had spent his childhood. At the orphanage, the stories she heard broke her heart further. Aaron had been abandoned as a baby, left with nothing but a hospital blanket. He had grown up under harsh conditions, often bullied by older children and overlooked by potential adoptive parents. Despite this, the staff spoke of his resilience and quiet kindness. He always believed he'd find a family one day, one caretaker said, her voice tinged with sadness. But when no one came, he stopped hoping. "He's a good boy, though, hard-working and proud." Eleanor left the orphanage with a lump in her throat. She couldn't undo the pain her son had endured, but she could give him the future he deserved. She resolved to speak to him, to reveal the truth, but not as his boss or a distant benefactor. She needed to approach him as a mother. However, as she prepared to meet Aaron, Eleanor's investigator delivered a shocking piece of news. The hospital staff responsible for the mix-up had been bribed to remain silent. And the person behind it? Her late husband, Richard. The revelation hit Eleanor like a freight train. Richard had always been controlling, but this? Had he known their son was alive all along? Why would he do such a thing? Eleanor realized she couldn't confront Aaron without unraveling the full truth. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they formed was far more sinister than she had imagined. Her hands trembled as she picked up her phone and dialed the investigator. "Find out everything," she said, her voice steely despite the turmoil within. "I need to know who else was involved and why." As Eleanor stood by the window, staring into the night, she knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But she was ready to face them, for her son, for the truth, and for the chance to heal the wounds of the past. Eleanor's thoughts were a storm as she prepared to meet Aaron for the first time. The investigator's findings had uncovered layers of betrayal she wasn't ready for, but the revelation that her late husband Richard orchestrated the separation from their son burned the deepest. Questions plagued her mind. Had Richard considered their son a threat to his legacy? Or was it simply a callous act to maintain control? But those questions would have to wait. Today, her focus was Aaron. Eleanor decided to meet him, not as the powerful CEO of Hard Industries, but as a humble woman seeking redemption. She dressed simply and left behind her usual entourage. Standing at the edge of the factory's parking lot, she watched as workers filed out for their lunch break. There he was, Aaron, seated alone under a tree, eating from a modest lunchbox. Summoning her courage, Eleanor approached him. Her heart raced as she drew nearer. He looked so much like her, his sharp features, the set of his jaw. She cleared her throat softly, and he looked up, startled. "Hi," she said, her voice trembling. "Mind if I sit here?" Aaron hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Sure," he replied curtly, his eyes wary. Eleanor sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, silence hung between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Finally, she spoke. "My name is Eleanor," she began. I've heard a lot about you, Aaron." He furrowed his brows, clearly puzzled. "From who? You don't look like you work here." "I don't," she admitted, forcing a smile. "But I own the company." His eyes widened, and he immediately stood, brushing crumbs from his hands. "Ma'am, I didn't mean to—" "Please, sit," Eleanor interrupted gently, her voice tinged with urgency. "This isn't about work. It's personal." Reluctantly, Aaron sat back down, his body tense. "What do you mean, personal?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she reached into her bag and pulled out an old photograph, a picture of herself holding a tiny pair of baby shoes. "This was taken the night I lost my son," she said, her voice breaking. Aaron's expression shifted from confusion to something more complex. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said cautiously, unsure where this was going. Eleanor met his gaze, tears brimming in her eyes. "Aaron, I think you're my son." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Aaron's face turned pale, and he stood abruptly. "What kind of sick joke is this?" he demanded, his voice filled with anger and disbelief. "It's not a joke," Eleanor pleaded, standing as well. "I've spent years searching for you. The hospital. There was a mix-up. They told me you had died, but it wasn't true. You were taken from me." Aaron shook his head, backing away. "Number, I've been on my own my whole life. No one cared about me then, and no one cares now." "I care," Eleanor said, stepping closer, her voice firm, despite the tears streaming down her face. "I've cared every single day since I lost you. I didn't know where you were or what had happened to you, but I never stopped searching." Aaron hesitated, his defenses wavering. "Why now? Why show up now, after all this time?" "Because I only just found out you were alive," Eleanor said earnestly, "and because I love you. I know I can't change the past, but I want to make things right. Please, Aaron, give me a chance." For a long moment, Aaron said nothing. His face was a battlefield of emotions, anger, disbelief, and something softer, more vulnerable. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can believe you." Eleanor nodded, her heart breaking anew. "I understand. Take all the time you need. I'll prove it to you. I promise." She handed him a business card with her contact information. "If you ever want to talk, call me. I'll be waiting." As Eleanor walked away, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the encounter, she couldn't help but glance back. Aaron stood where she had left him, staring at the card in his hand. She didn't know if he would ever forgive her or accept her as his mother. But she had taken the first step, and for now, that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor waited anxiously for a sign from Aaron. She checked her phone obsessively, hoping for a call or a message, but none came. Each passing day felt heavier than the last. She had expected his hesitation. His life had been filled with betrayal and disappointment, but the silence was unbearable. Eleanor refused to give up. Determined to keep her promise, she continued her investigation into the hospital scandal. The deeper she dug, the more horrifying the truth became. Richard hadn't just been involved in the cover-up. He had orchestrated it to ensure Eleanor wouldn't have a child who could complicate his business empire. He had paid the hospital staff to lie and arranged for the baby to be abandoned. Eleanor's grief turned into rage. How could the man she once loved have done something so monstrous? She vowed that Aaron would know the truth, every bitter detail, because he deserved justice, not just love. One evening, as she sat in her study lost in thought, her phone buzzed. Her heart leaped when she saw the message. "I want to meet. Tomorrow, 5 p.m. The park near the factory." It was Aaron. The next day, Eleanor arrived at the park early, her nerves frayed. She clutched a folder containing the evidence of Richard's betrayal, unsure how Aaron would react. She spotted him sitting on a bench under an oak tree, his posture tense. Eleanor approached cautiously. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. Aaron looked up, his eyes guarded. "I need answers," he said bluntly. "I've been thinking about what you said, but it doesn't make sense. Why would I end up in an orphanage if I was your son?" Eleanor sat down beside him, her hands trembling as she opened the folder. "Because my late husband, Richard, made sure you would," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. She handed him documents, hospital records, sworn statements from staff, and bank transactions. Aaron's hands shook as he read through them, his expression shifting from confusion to anger and then to devastation. "He knew you were alive," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "He didn't want a child to complicate his plans for Hart Industries. He had you taken away and paid everyone off to keep it quiet." Aaron clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "So I was nothing more than a problem to him? Just something to be thrown away?" Eleanor reached out, her voice filled with desperation. "You were never a problem to me. I loved you from the moment I knew I was carrying you. I didn't know what he had done. If I had, I would have fought for you with everything I had." Aaron stood abruptly, pacing in front of the bench. This is too much," he said, his voice shaking. "All my life, I thought I was worthless, that no one cared. And now you're telling me I had a family all along?" "You still have a family," Eleanor said, standing as well. "Me. I know I can't erase the pain you've been through, but I want to be here for you, Aaron, as your mother, if you'll let me." For a long moment, Aaron didn't respond. Then slowly, he turned to face her. His eyes were filled with tears, but his expression was softer. "You really mean that?" "With all my heart," Eleanor said, stepping closer. "I've spent years building an empire, but none of it matters if I can't have my son back." Aaron looked at her for what felt like an eternity before nodding, his defenses crumbling. "I don't know how to do this. How to have a mother," he admitted. Eleanor smiled through her tears. "We'll figure it out together." In the months that followed, Eleanor and Aaron began to rebuild what had been stolen from them. She helped him leave the factory and pursue his dreams of becoming an architect, something he had always secretly wanted, but never dared to hope for. Eleanor also took steps to honor the life he had lived. She funded programs at the orphanage and created a scholarship for children who had aged out of the system. Aaron, though hesitant at first, began to see the depth of her love and commitment. The final step in their journey came one evening when Aaron invited Eleanor to a small, humble gathering. He stood before the crowd and spoke from his heart. "For a long time, I thought I was alone in this world," he said, his voice steady. "But I've learned that sometimes Even in the darkest places, light finds its way back to you. I'm proud to say that light came in the form of my mother, Eleanor Hart. Eleanor's tears flowed freely as she embraced her son. For the first time in decades, her heart felt whole. The past had left scars, but together they had forged a future filled with love, understanding, and the strength to overcome anything. This concludes our story of redemption, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. Stay tuned to Stories of Brilliance for more stories, filled with twists, turns, and the triumph of the human spirit.